Welcome again to the 21st episode of our Ideas and Lives series, where we interview people with interesting lives and compelling ideas. And today we're pleased to welcome Bill Sharpe, Nobel Prize winner in economics, and Svi Bodhi, my partner on this series, is going to introduce Bill properly as a fellow financial economist and colleague. It's all yours, Svi.
Okay, well, welcome, Bill, to we call it the Bob and Svi show. And I know you've had lots of interviews, and we are extremely appreciative that you've agreed to this one. I kind of regard you as a mentor, even though I never took a course with you. Way back when you came out with your asset allocation tools, maybe that was in the 1970s or the 80s. I was among the adopters, and I used it in my classes, and so I've been, following you all along closely. And I've been entertained by your satirical videos, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. The only thing I haven't had the pleasure of is hearing you play piano.
Oh, that's just as well. And I'm not sure pleasure is the term.
Okay. Well, so my first question is, you studied economics at UCLA, although that wasn't, you were going to be a doctor. You started out, but you say that Armin Alkian and Fred Weston were your mentors, and what did you get from them?
Okay, let me start. Well, Armin Alkian was the microeconomist, I guess you would say, in the economics department at UCLA. And he was a fabulous character and a fabulous economist. I took, as a graduate student, I took his required 3-quarter or 2-semester, I can't remember which it was then, all-year course on microeconomics for graduate students. And he would come in and say, well, it's interesting. We have free markets for things. I wonder why they don't have free markets for babies. and he would scratch his head. Then he would turn to the board, and in the course of the hour or whatever the length was, he would sort of muddle through, think of this. Well, I don't know. He'd draw some diagrams. He advised us not to read the literature because 92%, I think was his number, was irrelevant. And he's very opinionated, but a very sweet person. We graduate students would go back to the TA room where we had desks and discuss the session. And I would go home and type up my notes and then bring them, and we would make ditto copies and have another session. But he, I would say, taught me to think like an economist. And I can bore you with what I mean by that.
How did you choose to go into economics in grad school?
Well, I don't want to drop Fred Weston, so let me quickly talk about Fred.
Sure.
As an undergraduate, I was a research assistant for Fred and got to know him personally quite well. And in our PhD program, we in economics were required, I think, to have 5 subfields. And I found in small print that one of them could be finance, which I knew next to nothing about. So it was one of my 5 fields. And he was on my committee and was a very major influence. He was one of the very first economists, he was from Chicago, to go into the field of finance, which until then had been very, let me say, pragmatic. as the nicest thing I can say about it.
Right.
But
Extension of accounting, right?
yes, well, yes, or worse. But you asked how I got in economics. I'll give you a short version. I went to Cal for my freshman year. My mother wanted me to be a doctor, and I had various revelations. I didn't like the sight of blood, and it seemed to me that was not a good portent. So I transferred to UCLA. Originally, I think in business, although I'm not sure we had to declare a major, but that was my intent. And one of the first courses I took was Econ 1, which was microeconomics, price theory, let's call it, from a lovely guy named Marvell Stockwell. It was a big lecture class with TA breakout sessions. I just loved that. I'd never had any inkling of what economics was about. It was, of course, not taught in high schools in those days. And I just loved it. I loved how you could take an issue, draw some diagrams, find where the two curves crossed, and that would be the price and the quantity. And I just thought it was wonderful. So I changed my major, had no notion what I was going to do for a living, but I didn't care.
And then you went to work at,
in grad school at UCLA.
well, he went to work for Rand.
Well, yes, both. I was in the ROTC, so I had to do active duty, which would have been normally a 2-year gig, and but I was able to postpone it a year and took a master's in economics, and I'll tell you why. In my senior year, I started interviewing banks because where else would an econ major work? And the typical interview would be, well, how are you? And let me look at your documents, and you have very good grades. And initially I thought that was a good thing. I learned for bankers at that time, at least, it was a bad thing. And towards the end, I would turn the form over and said, look, I was in a fraternity and I was Commodore of the Sailing Club and blah, blah, blah. I'm an actual human being. You could put me in front of your customers. But in any event, the job search didn't go particularly well. And so I decided to stay on and get a master's, a 1-year master's, and then go into the service.
Where did you do the service?
Did the service at Fort Lee, Virginia. I was in the Quartermaster Corps. And had, I'll tell you one anecdote from that period. And it was shortened to 6 months because of my job at Rand, and then 8 years of reserve. But in that setting, I discovered that about half the enlisted men had not completed high school, and that there was a high school equivalent set of courses and diploma available. So I gave a pep talk and got a large number of them to sign up, which made me a persona non grata with the other enlisted men, because the people in the course didn't have to pull kitchen duty, latrine duty, whatever. And so the others had to do more. But I was very pleased with that. And I'm a great believer in compulsory service with mixing of people, as is done in Switzerland and Israel. And
Right.
I just think sociologically that's an extremely good idea. I learned a lot.
Yeah, it's never caught on as a political,
Not in
idea.
this country.
In this country.
No, there was we talked about the Peace Corps and some of the other things, but the idea that it would be compulsory. We're so siloed in this country, and it's
Well, we did have the draft for a period, and
well, we had. But I'd rather not have to go to war to get this
Right.
thing to happen.
Right.
right.
Listen, we can't even make vaccination mandatory.
Yes, indeed. You're right on that one.
All right. So you went. So at that point, you did your service, and then you worked for Rand before or during your UCLA
No,
PhD period?
I talked to Armin Alch, and Armin was one of many people in the department who was doing part-time consulting at Rand. Rand was in Santa Monica, very close to Westwood. And I said, this Rand Corporation sounds like just the place I would be happy. Can you get me a job there? And he said, oh, yeah. And so he did. And as a result of that, I was able to shorten my active duty to 6 months. So I did the bachelor's, master's, active duty, Rand. And that was the sequence.
And then you ran into Harry Markowitz at Rand, right?
Yes, in a kind of a convoluted way. I was in the logistics department doing operations research kinds of things rather than sort of traditional economics. And I had started a dissertation on transfer pricing, within a corporation, having division A, who makes the chassis, sell the chassis to division B, which assembles the car, et cetera. And I thought it was a pretty good dissertation with Alch and Fred Weston. And Armin, I guess, told me Jack Hirschleifer, who had been at Chicago and was moving to UCLA, who had done the seminal work that I was building on, is coming, and he's going to be actually at Rand. Why don't you go talk to him and see what he thinks? He should be your chair. So I introduced myself to Jack, handed him my 50% of my dissertation. He said, give me a week. And Jack, who is another wonderful human being, said, Bill, I just don't think there's a dissertation here. I said, oh, okay. So I went to Fred Weston and said, Fred, what am I going to do? He said, well, you really like that work by Harry Markowitz. He's coming to Rand. Why don't you go talk to Harry and see if he thinks there might be something there? So I went to talk to Harry, and that was how I started down the path. I can tell you about the 3 parts of the dissertation, unless you're already very bored.
No. This is what we want to hear.
Go for it. Go for it.
Well, the first part was sort of playing with and writing an algorithm to compute what I called the single index model. Sometimes I've called it the diagonal model, but this basically assumes that the only way in which security A moves with security B is because of they're both in the market. So there's a sort of a single factor that most securities respond to, and then their idiosyncratic part. So, and I called it diagonal model because when you set up a matrix, that's what it looks like. So the first one was building some algorithms and writing some programs. Probably the first economics dissertation with the programs in it. And then the second part, Fred had put me in touch with an actual financial advisor in LA. And he and I sort of worked out a scheme where he would create inputs for a single index diagonal model. And then I would run it and see if the portfolios that it produced made any sense to them. And it turned out they didn't. And then the third part, I did what microeconomists are trained to do. Assume everybody's optimizing and they go to market and prices adjust. What can you say about the equilibrium, the prices that ensue? And so I did that, and I got this wonderful result about, the only risky portfolio you should consider has almost no risk other than that associated with the market as a whole. And beta is a measure of the sensitivity of a security to the market, and the expected returns in an equilibrium should be related to the betas. And so it was the precursor, if you will, of the capital asset pricing model. But it assumed that the only correlation between two securities was due to their relationship with this market factor. And so when I went to the University of Washington Business School, after I finished the dissertation in June, went to UW in September, and I thought this is a really nifty idea and conclusion. I just went, but it was I sort of felt like I put the rabbit in the hat by making the assumption that about the covariances, about the relationships, and then I pulled it out. And so I thought, boy, wouldn't it be great if I could get that result without making the assumptions? Just create the rabbit out of first principles. So I played around with things, and in 2 or 3 or 4 months, found out I didn't need the assumptions. The result was more general. That was the capital asset pricing model. That's more, I'm
Wow.
sorry
And
to
so-
stop me when I go on with these answers.
No,
because-
so
No,
wait a minute. So you came up with that as, in a way, an extension of your dissertation.
Yes.
We recently interviewed a physics Nobel Prize winner. So you forgot to mention Bill's Nobel. But anyway.
I was saving it for later.
Oh, okay. Physics Nobel, who also got the Nobel for his work as a postdoc, which
Really?
was at first not fully recognized. Now, was your CAPM extension of what you had started with your dissertation, was that quickly recognized by the profession, or did it take a little while?
Well, for some of your younger viewers, I need to explain, in those days, communication was by mail and by telephone. And there was, I actually finished that paper for all practical purposes in the spring of '62. And it was originally rejected by a referee for the Journal of Finance. And I appealed, and then the editorship changed. And in any event, it took till '64 for the publication. So when it was published, I thought, well, the phone's going to start ringing. And it didn't. And I waited. I sat by the phone in my office, and it didn't. And I got almost no reaction for months. And I thought, I know this is going to be the best paper I will ever write. And nobody cares. So it was a very different world, but eventually people started noticing it.
Well, let me ask you about that. There were 4 people that I know of who, around that same time, more or less independently, I think, came up with some version of a capital asset pricing model. What was the name of the, well, so there was, you'll have to help me here.
I can only probably find you 3, but in the process, the paper was floating around. I'd given a version of it at a sort of a small seminar that Wells Fargo arranged, but Mert Miller was there and a number of other people. And so the result was out there to some extent at least. And I heard in the process, after I'd written it, submitted it, and presented it, I heard that Jack Traynor, who was then a PhD student at Harvard, Yeah, I think that's right. Had something similar, and so I corresponded with Jack, and so I first learned of that after the paper was finished and blah blah blah, and then John Lintner published a paper a year. Well, he called me after my paper was published and said, "Well, there's something wrong in your paper." And he introduced himself, and I said, "Well, okay." And he said, "I would, we need to talk, and maybe if you write something, a retraction or something, I won't publish against yours." He said, "I have a similar result." So we met at the annual economics conference in New York, I think it was, and I can't say that I ever fully understood what his objection was. I wrote a sort of a strange little footnote that was published in the Journal of Finance, which only indicated I didn't really understand what he was saying. And then Jan Mossine was working at UCLA, and he did a paper. But Jan had said that he had read my paper. Jack's work was definitely, Jack came at it from a corporate finance standpoint, so he came in a different direction.
Yeah, Jack Trainer, according to Jack Trainer, who I discussed this with, he took it to Franco Modigliani, and Franco was unimpressed.
Yeah, he said, yeah, I think I've heard that story, and got to know Franco and had some slightly argumentative discussions with him over a couple of matters at a conference. But yeah, I think, well, again, Jack came to it in a different way, sort of from a cost of capital, as I recall. So it didn't, and at least the version of his paper that I had read back when, again, long after I'd finished and submitted mine, it didn't seem to have the import in terms of that mine did. But I'm not saying he didn't have a similar result. He did.
Right. There's another thing. You sort of were first in a lot of different things in finance, that some of which you haven't really gotten credit for. And one of them it turned out to be really, really important for financial engineering, and that is the binomial option pricing.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'll tell you the story of that. And if I'm telling too many stories.
No,
we want stories. We want stories.
Because my friends in Carmel, where I've lived for now 20 plus years, tend to be doctors and medical researchers, et cetera, and they have no interest in these topics. So this is a great opportunity. I wrote a textbook, which USV will relate to. And
I taught from that textbook for years.
And when I was working on the chapter on options, I thought, of course I put the Black-Scholes model in. I mean, one does. But I thought, it's just this formula. And in a textbook, you sort of want to get people to understand why it's this formula, or, what's the economics. And so I started planning. I said, well, I'll do an example. My initial example was you buy a stock for 100 and it can go up next year to 120 or down to 90. That's it. Chance 50-50, let's say. And somebody offers you a deal where they'll pay you something if it goes up. How much, should you pay for that particular deal? And so I started playing around and got a nice little result. And then I played around some more, and I found that if you make the interval not a year, if it's got a year maturity, but a half a year, it jumps once in a half a year, then it jumps again in another half a year. You've got a somewhat different result because, among other things, you've got more points, etc. In any event, and then I started writing some programs. And I found that if you made the interval between now and the maturity shorter and shorter, the result converged to the Black-Scholes pricing model. And I thought, well, that's very cool. And somewhere in the process of playing around with this, John Cox, who was a colleague at Stanford and used to come to work at 5 and liked to talk before he started doing research into the night, came to my office and said, well, what are you working on? I said, well, let me show you this, John. So I showed it to him and he said, well, that's really interesting. I'm in the midst of writing a paper with a couple of colleagues, Steve Ross and Mark Rubenstein, on options. And this would really fit in nicely. Would you like to be a co-author? And I said, no, I don't need to be a co-author. Give me a nice footnote or prefatory remark, which, by the way, they did. So that was where it was published and in my textbook. And the thing that's neat about it is you can value all kinds of things. You do it in a multi-period with discrete jumps, make the period short, and you can do options that can be cashed in before maturity. You can do all kinds of weird things. And at some point, I know Mark told me that the industry was using that binomial, and then other people did trinomial with 3 branches, blah, 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 but was using those discrete computerized valuations in some ways more than Black-Scholes formula, which I doubt. And Black-Scholes-Merton as it's now said appropriately, because Bob was involved. Anyway, so that was that.
Yeah, well,
that was the beginning.
Binomial.
Yeah, I did a little bit. I did a couple of papers that used some of that, but I didn't really do much more with it.
So the binomial model is known as the Cox-Ross-Rubenstein model,
Yes.
CRR, and
Yes.
it's really CRRS.
Well, if you read if you read the paper, there's a nice note right in the foreword to the paper about we got this from Sharpe. But so be it.
Well, yeah, you got your Nobel Prize, and
Not for that.
no, yeah. I know none of the others did.
By the way,
Ross-Rubenstein.
our physics Nobel Prize winner also told us that he did something subsequently. You'll be able to watch it. He did something subsequently that would have done it more, and he had already won one. So
Well, I would just quarrel with that to the extent I don't think anybody really knows what would have or could have or should have won.
Right.
Maybe
Yeah.
should
Right.
have, but so
Everybody's got their favorite.
yeah.
Should have gotten a Nobel Prize.
favorite contribution. Tell us about when
you
you
all
heard
know
about
this,
the-
but some of your listeners might not. But the year that Harry Markowitz and Mert Miller and I won was the first prize that went to somebody for work in financial economics or finance. There had been prior ones with Franco Modigliani who had done work in the field, but that wasn't even, I think, cited significantly. And I, at least, had convinced myself that financial economists would never get the prize. And so it was truly a surprise.
It was 1990, and that was the first of what turned out to be many. I think there have been more Nobel Prizes in the field of financial economics than in any other subfield.
Probably than any other subfield. I don't think there have been more than in all the other subfields combined. I mean, even since
No,
19.
no, no,
No,
no.
no,
But
no.
there have been, you're right, there have been a number. And of course, then you get into, arguments as to how you define the field.
Well, that's it's because of Zvi's friendship. When I was chair at American University's economics department, we created a master's program in financial economics for public policy. And it then came home to me how much of the separation between economics and finance has been the case with typically finance departments not in economics departments, and resulting in what I believe to be very poor knowledge of the finance contributions by mainstream economists. Do you have that feeling?
Well, yes. Again, I'm not current enough to really speak to current situation. It was certainly the case when I went to Stanford, and I must admit, I befriended some folks in the econ department, which was in another building, of course, and I actually begged to be allowed to at least teach Econ 1 in the department, which I did. So I and some of them tried to bridge the gap a bit, but yes, it was very definitely the case. And when I started in finance, there was a good reason for economists not to circulate with finance people, because it wasn't much theory there. There wasn't much rigor. It was sort of tales,
Right.
case studies, what have you.
It was really the 1970s that saw finance become
That's right.
a well-established discipline. And in fact, I have to mention this book, one of my favorites, Investors and Markets, by none other than Bill Sharpe. This was his Princeton lectures back, I guess it was in the 90s still, the 1990s.
No, I think it was in the 2000s.
2000s?
We could
Yeah, you're right. But what's interesting is rather than develop the subject using the capital asset pricing model, Bill went back to more basic Arrow-Debreu state preference theory. And I really, I respect that a lot.
Well,
really.
Can I riff on that?
Yeah, you better give a short. Now we're getting even more technical.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's a very, very important subject that I would like to say a little bit about. Finance and financial economics, at least in the investment area and in the uncertainty area, came basically from Harry Markowitz's work. That was the root. I mean, you can go back for interest rates and such to the 30s for that matter, but certainly a lot of it came. The finance dealing with uncertainty, let me say, came in large part from Harry's work, and then mine, and then on and on it went.
Harry being in the 1950s and then 60s.
That was in the 60s.
Sharpe.
And finance and the business schools had been case studies. Here's what they did, and it was only when actually in Fred Weston's generation, and much of it at Chicago, where you started getting economics applied to issues of finance. And there was a strand that didn't deal with uncertainty, and then the strand that I trace back to Harry dealt with uncertainty. And so finance and the business schools sort of came from those backgrounds. As I say, I insisted on teaching Econ 1 in the department just to prove that I knew something about Econ 1 at least, as opposed to, portfolio theory and capital markets. And it is slow, it has moved, but there still is a division. There's certainly, I taught an econ upper division course in the economics department at Stanford. So it's moved, but there certainly was in the 70s, 80s, 90s, a real division, which was most unfortunate. But now, if you look at just look at the econ prizes, and you'll see, people in econ departments getting prizes for work, some of which we think of as part of finance, and et cetera. And to go to Ken Arrow's work, Harry's model and my work that came out of it were sort of continuous. You had a thing that could have been, a return on a portfolio that could have been any of a bunch of numbers between X and Y. And so you had sort of that view. And about the time of Harry's work, Ken Arrow and somewhat independently Gerard Debreu, then at Stanford and Cal Berkeley, did this fantastic grand theory. And in theirs, basically, uncertainty was different states of the world. And they didn't even, probabilities of those states didn't play, as I saw it at least, a major role. And they built fantastic models of equilibrium, et cetera. And I had first learned about that quite early on after my dissertation, and found it quite fabulous and fascinating. So I all from the start tried to look at the world in some sense in both ways.
You had a paper that I love. In fact, I used to teach it all the time. Nuclear, financial, economic. What was it? Nuclear.
I remember the title. I don't remember the paper. I can tell you that.
But it was Arrow Debreu. It was state preference.
Yeah, and I did a book on portfolio theory in the, what was it? I think it was published in 70 maybe. And I had a chapter there in it on Arrow Debreu, which was a mess. I mean, I'm embarrassed to even talk about it. It was just a mess. But I was trying to think in those terms. And Jack Hirschleifer, that I mentioned earlier, did some wonderful work coming at uncertainty in that manner. So I started trying to think about the world in that way, and that chapter in this revision of my textbook, I don't think it was in the original version. It might have been, but in any event, it didn't work out. I'm not very pleased. I was not very pleased with it in retrospect, but yes, it seemed to me that that's an important way. And then the Investors in Markets is a book that came out of the Princeton lectures, as you said. And there I tried to start with a state preference. You have 3 states of the world. You'll get this, or you'll get that, or you'll lose that.
And then he pointed out that that's consistent with the capital asset pricing model.
It is.
But that was almost a footnote.
Well, no. Well, actually, there's a chapter in which I derived a result, but it's not the traditional CAPM result.
Right.
And that book, I was looking back at that book because I think you'd mentioned it when we talked. And for that book, I wrote this humongous suite of programs, which I wrote in the C language, which is one of the most disgusting programming languages that was ever invented. And I somehow or other learned enough, and I wrote all these programs in the C language, and I put them on my website. And I just this morning went to the website and found, yes, it's there, but the link is broken, and, which is just as well. But the whole idea was to I was trying to, in the book and on the lectures and in the book, to give a sort of an overview of financial economics under uncertainty, building from more of a state, it can be A, B, or C. And I wrote the book, hopefully for a master's course, level course, and thought, and so I used a lot of, instead of lots of formulas, because my math is trivial, I wrote programs that would just keep going until there was an equilibrium established between these two people, and then look at the properties. And so that's how the book was written and the programs behind it.
But you've always tried to bring it all the way down to the world of practical finance, practical asset allocation.
I have.
That raises another question that I have, which is, now I finished my graduate school before the 70s revolution in finance. Maybe I would have majored in it, but it wasn't around quite yet. I've always, when I started looking at works on uncertainty and risk, I have found that the finance way of looking at it is actually a lot simpler than what economists sometimes create in their models. And I wonder whether you have that same impression. I mean, I'm not an expert on this. So,
well, yes and no. First of all, my work certainly conforms to that description. My mathematics was an introductory, one semester course in calculus at a local junior college that I took when I was at the Rand Corporation. That's my entire math, and many of my colleagues would say, yeah, and it shows. So,
well, but you're a programming whiz.
well, I don't know if I'm whiz, but I've done a lot of programming, and I don't know. I think Zvi, you've read the book Trillions, and Robin, and the author of that book, which is a wonderful book on indexing funds, calls me programmer economist.
There you go.
Which I'm perfectly happy to accept as a title.
well, let's go back to the question about handling uncertainty in most economic models and in finance models.
Well, there was no uncertainty in economic courses, in beginning courses, certainly in my day.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And it sort of crept in bit by bit in Econ 1, but it's I can't honestly say what is in those textbooks or what is taught, but I would think, I find Arrow de Brue, state preference, states of the world, a much easier way to describe uncertainty and equilibrium pricing, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what I did in investments and markets. So I would hope that in the econ courses, they come at it in that manner.
Well, it's also,
let me just say this very quickly, I cannot read, or at least choose to not read, the vast majority of articles in the major finance journals these days. They are so mathematical, and I just don't have the math. So in some ways, I use discrete, that is, states of the world approaches in thinking about things, because I have to, rather than using elegant continuous time mathematics.
yeah, it's the quantitative finance stuff is often located in math departments rather than in the business school. I don't know how it is at Stanford.
I was, I don't really know what is now taught in the econ. I taught the introductory econ course in the MBA program a few times. And at that point at Stanford, when in the earlier days, one of the faculty members who actually has recently won a Nobel Prize, a fabulous mathematician, was adamant that there should be no requirement that you have calculus to take courses in the MBA program, at least the required courses. And so I would start my class talking about, well, here's this curve, and if you have a teeny weeny little change to get the notion of a slope, as a first derivative, but I didn't call it a first derivative.
Right. Now let's talk about your contributions to the practice of finance. When did you start getting into that as a consultant first, and then you had some monumental consulting jobs, didn't you?
I don't know if they're monumental.
Well, you were the brains behind the first robo-advice engine, financial engines.
I don't think it was, it almost certainly wasn't the very first. There was, at least as I recall, some guy in San Francisco that was pretty much contemporaneous. I don't think much came of that. But, I always, and again, Rand, as Rand made me. I'm a creature of the Rand Corporation, at least in that time. And which involved theory in practice, theory applied to practice, etc. And so I always had that focus once I joined academe. So I consulted for Merrill Lynch quite early on in New York, and then associated with Bill Faust's group, I think of it at Wells Fargo, and then did some firms of my own, which we can talk about if you're interested. In financial engines, one of them, the latter one, certainly applying factor models, equilibrium pricing, et cetera, et cetera.
I remember in the early days, like the 60s and 70s, firms on Wall Street would hire a quant. They called them token quants.
Mm-hmm.
And it was not to
your face.
That's right. That's right. Because they didn't take it seriously, but they just felt, well, everybody had to have a quant, so they could say, yes, we've got the most advanced models, which nobody paid any attention to. Well, and that has completely turned around.
Yeah, the group that I consulted with had for a period been headed by Jack Traynor, who had left to be the editor of the Financial Analyst Journal. And it was headed by Gil Hammer when I was there. And basically we produced, for example, a beta book in which the head of your corporate pension fund could look up the beta of a stock to see how sensitive it would be for market moves. And we provided a consulting service in which we could go in and look at your pension fund and estimate the beta of your pension fund in terms of how, and for that matter, the residual risk, the risk over and above that of the market. And, was it all play gaming or done, for the, to show that
marketing.
Well, or in the part of the pension fund, we've met our fiduciary responsibility. We have these statistics, of course, there was some of that. I liked to think at the time it wasn't just that, or it wasn't wholly that, but some of the earliest work in applying the theory. And in my case, I learned things which allowed me to produce better theory, more maybe different theory than had I not. And again, the whole idea of being close enough to practice and yet close enough to theory to provide things that are useful and somewhat elegant at the same time was something I'd learned at Rand.
Yeah.
Now in your retirement at the ripe old age of 88,
No, not yet, but about
87 and a half,
close, yeah.
Are you still consulting actively, or are you just, well, I say just, I know that you're busy putting out, doing research because you make it all accessible at your website.
Well, no, I'm not consulting, have not been for a number of years now. And I'm doing research to some extent, but as I mentioned before, my friends here, we used to have coffee groups, now we have Zoom groups, and some, happen to be a group of really fascinating people, but many of them with PhDs or MDs. But they tend to be predominantly, in the sciences and in particular in medical areas. So I don't have very many conversations over coffee, except with Usvi, who we have come.
Well, I of course appreciate your sense of humor. He's got some really funny satirical animations that he's done. One of them is called The Wrong Financial Advisor.
Wrong Investment Advisor. I think
Wrong Investment Advisor.
Yeah, let me and let's tout that. And there are a couple of others, but that's the one that has some huge number of views on YouTube.
And has been translated, right?
My grandson translated it into Spanish, I think. It was some people in Portugal, I think, or even though they were in Portugal, they translated it to Spanish. That arose from one of my joint surgeries, and I was recuperating and not sleeping well. And so I sort of came up with this idea, and there was this wonderful software, basically free. It cost a modest amount to use, but where you could produce these sort of totally unrealistic cartoony characters and have them talk to each other. And I did that, and I did two others, one on a pension fund method that I opposed, and I can't remember what
the pension obligation bond one.
Pension obligation bonds, yeah, and then I can't remember what the third one was. They were nowhere near as popular, but
well, because they're a little bit esoteric.
Well, and Jason Zwig didn't send out a link to his entire mailing list, which is what helped me in the other. But
he's the Wall Street Journal finance correspondent.
Great human being and a great guy all around.
Yeah.
But yeah, I put in sort of all the bad and the unrealism, lack of realism in the cartoon characters, I think makes it even funnier.
Yes, it does, because they really are obviously, mechanical. Type.
Just to build on that a minute, as V knows, I have taught Scratch programming in a language developed at MIT over many years to kids in a summer program here, and I wrote, and they added to Scratch the ability to have voices, and you can even choose not only the voice but also the language, so it will translate and etc. And I did 2 or 3 things on retirement using that Scratch and made them publicly available on my blog, but they have not generated. I think I looked at one of them that's been up for 3 or 4 years, and the number of views is somewhere around 80 or 90. It's just nothing.
I know. Yeah, my books for the mass market have suffered a similar kind of fate.
Well, investor markets was remaindered within 12 months.
There you go. Well, that's all right.
Well, wow, it's what a career.
Now, of course, with this interview, it's going to just go viral. Viral.
That's right. That's
Well,
right.
for people in the know, it is, and we really appreciate it. I hope you've enjoyed the interview as well. We love to hear these stories, and of course, you can hear more stories, very interesting stories, with some of our other.
Indeed.
Yeah, now we're up to 21.
You're amazing. I must say, I've always feared interviews, especially recorded ones where you can't, say, well, let me say that again. But I knew Zvi was a really splendid fellow to chat with, and now I know that you both are. So I thank you both.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. And
we can't do any better than that, but we do have an important ending.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, this is our ending. Sei gesund. That is Yiddish, and it means be well, but that's how you say goodbye.
Sei gesund.
Sei gesund.
Lovely. I will try to remember it and add to my relatively small stock of Yiddish expressions. Thank you.
Okay, well,
Thank you both very much, and stay safe.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
I'm
Bye-bye.
going to stop the recording.